Ever wondered why two people can look at the same object and perceive it differently? It's all down to a fascinating process we call perception. It's like your brain's own personal artist, painting a picture of the world around you. But instead of using a brush and canvas, it uses sensory information. Perception is the way we interpret this sensory information to understand our environment. It's the bridge between raw data and meaningful experiences. Imagine you're holding a warm cup of coffee. You're not just feeling the heat, you're perceiving it as comforting. Now, there are different types of perception. There's visual perception, where your eyes take in light and your brain transforms it into images. There's auditory perception, turning vibrations in the air into the sweet melody of your favorite song. And then there are the Gestalt principles of perception, which help us make sense of complex images and scenes. So how exactly do these different types of perception work? Let's dive in. Imagine walking into a room full of people. How do you distinguish one person from another? Visual perception is the key. It's our brain's way of interpreting the light that enters our eyes and painting a comprehensive picture of the world around us. This process is a complex one, involving several stages and many parts of both the eye and brain. Let's break it down. First, light enters the eye through the cornea, the clear front surface of the eye, and then passes through the pupil and the lens which focus the light. This light then reaches the retina, the light-sensitive tissue lining the back of our eye. It's here that the magic begins. The retina contains millions of specialized cells called rods and cones that convert light into electrical signals. Rods help us see in low-light conditions, while cones are responsible for our ability to perceive color and fine detail. These electrical signals are then sent via the optic nerve to the brain, where they're interpreted and transformed into the images we see. This process allows us to perceive depth, color, and motion. Think about how you can tell if an object is close or far away. That's depth perception at work. As for color, it's thanks to our cones that we can appreciate a vibrant sunset or a painting's subtle hues. And motion perception? It's why we can catch a ball thrown at us or dodge an obstacle in our path. But visual perception isn't just about seeing. It's about understanding and interpreting the world around us. It's about distinguishing a friend's face in a crowd, recognizing an object's shape regardless of its orientation, or even understanding the emotions conveyed by a person's facial expressions. It's a fundamental part of how we navigate and interact with our environment. So that's how we see the world around us. But what about the sounds we hear? Ever listened to a song and wondered how you're able to recognize the different instruments being played? This is the magic of auditory perception, an intricate process that never fails to amaze. Let's start from the beginning. Auditory perception begins when sound waves, which are essentially vibrations in the air, enter our ears. They travel down the ear canal and hit the eardrum, causing it to vibrate. These vibrations are then passed along tiny bones in the middle ear, which further amplify the sound. The journey doesn't end there. These amplified vibrations reach the inner ear, or the cochlea, which is filled with fluid and lined with thousands of tiny hair cells. As the fluid in the cochlea vibrates, it causes these hair cells to move. This movement is then transformed into electrical signals, which are sent through the auditory nerve to the brain. And voila! The brain interprets these signals as sound, allowing us to recognize and appreciate the symphony of noises in our world. But auditory perception isn't just about recognizing sound, it's about understanding it. For example, the pitch of a sound, whether it's high or low, is determined by the frequency of the sound wave. A high-frequency sound wave translates into a high-pitched sound like a bird's chirp, while a low-frequency sound wave results in a low-pitched sound, like a drum beat. Loudness, on the other hand, is determined by the amplitude or the height of the sound wave. A tall wave will sound loud, while a short wave will sound soft. And then there's timbre, the quality of a sound that allows us to distinguish between different sources of sound, even if they're the same pitch and loudness. It's what makes a piano sound different from a guitar, even when they're playing the same note. That's how we make sense of the sounds around us. But perception isn't just about seeing and hearing. Ever noticed how sometimes the whole seems greater than the sum of its parts? This isn't just a philosophical musing, but the heart of the Gestalt principles of perception, a set of rules that describe how our brains interpret sensory information to recognize patterns and make sense of the world. Let's start with proximity. This principle suggests that objects or shapes that are close to one another are perceived as a group. For instance, If you see a flock of birds flying together in the sky, you perceive them as one unit, not as individual birds. It's a nifty trick our brain uses to simplify the vast amount of visual data it receives. Next comes similarity. This principle dictates that elements that are similar to each other, be it in color, shape, or size, are perceived as part of the same group. Think of a chessboard. The alternating black and white squares create a pattern that our brains interpret as two groups, black squares and white squares. Then we have continuity. Our brains love smooth lines and curves. When we see intersecting lines or shapes, we tend to perceive them as part of a continuous line or pattern, rather than as separate entities. This principle often comes into play in graphic design and art, where it's used to guide the viewer's eye through a composition. Closure is another fascinating principle. Even when an object is incomplete or a space is not fully enclosed, our brains prefer to see whole, complete forms. So, we fill in the gaps. If you've ever seen a picture of a panda that's just a few black and white patches, yet you still recognize it as a panda, that's closure at work. Finally, there's the figure ground principle. This is all about how we distinguish an object from its surroundings. We perceive figures, or objects, as existing on a background or ground. For example, you're reading this script right now. The words, or figures, stand out against the white page or ground. We automatically separate the two, allowing us to focus on the important information, the words. All these principles work together to help us make sense of what we see. They demonstrate that perception isn't just about passively receiving information. Instead, it's an active process. Our brains don't just take in data, they interpret it, find patterns, and make connections. It's a complex process, but one that happens so seamlessly, we're usually not even aware of it. But by understanding these principles, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the incredible work our brains do every second of every day. These principles shape how we perceive and make sense of the world around us. So, we've taken a journey through the fascinating world of perception. We've probed the depths of how our minds interpret sensory information and how this interpretation shapes our understanding of the world around us. We kicked off our journey with an introduction to perception, where we learned that perception is the process by which our brains make sense of all the sensory data we encounter every day. It's like the director of our own personal movie, shaping and editing the raw footage of our sensory experiences into something meaningful. Then, we dove into the realm of visual perception. We discovered that our eyes are not just passive receivers of light, but active interpreters of visual data. They are constantly at work, deciphering details like color, shape, and movement. It's like they're painting a picture for our brains, one stroke at a time. Next, we ventured into the world of auditory perception. We learned that our ears are not just simple sound catchers, but intricate translators of auditory information. They convert the vibrations in the air around us into electrical signals that our brains can understand. It's like they're composing a symphony for our minds, one note at a time. Finally, we explored the Gestalt principles of perception. These principles showed us that our brains tend to perceive things as a whole, rather than a collection of parts. It's like our minds are puzzle solvers, piecing together the sensory information to create a cohesive image of the world. All these elements of perception work together, allowing us to navigate and interact with our environment. Understanding perception helps us appreciate the complexity of our sensory experiences and the intricate processes that allow us to interpret them. Remember, perception is not just about what we see or hear. It's about how we interpret those sensory inputs to understand our world. So the next time you look at something, take a moment to appreciate the complex processes that allow you to perceive it. Subscribe and don't forget to take care of yourselves. Goodbye.